It's M, the beginner crafter. Today I'm going to show you my first design. It's made with the filet crochet technique, and right now it can serve as a coaster, and it can be made into different sizes depending on what size you need for your glasses or flutes or mugs or cups, whatever. So far I've made two. This one is made with Anchor and I used 1.25mm hook, and this one is made with Ariadna Musa 10 and I used a 1mm crochet hook. I usually use smaller sizes if the yarn gives you a range, like for example the one I'll be using today, Schaepjes Maxi Sugar Rush. It says you can use 1.25 or 1.5. I prefer the smaller hook because I think the stitches are a bit more defined this way, so you can see the design a little bit easier. This one is in the shape of a heart. I know it's a quite popular design, so I may not be the first one to create such a coaster. However, I want to make it into a series with all card suits. So the heart, the diamond, the clubs, and the spade. What you're going to need for making this coaster is, of course, yarn. Today I'll be using Schaepjes Maxi Sugar Rush or Sugar Rush Maxi. I'll also be using crochet hook 1.25. It's also good to have stitch markers. I'll be also using row counter just because it makes it easier for me to know where I am. Just let's set it to 0 for now. Some scissors, and at the end a tapestry needle so that you can weave in all the ends. Okay, so we're going to start by making a slip knot, and the way you make a slip knot is up to you. Everyone is fine. And we're going to make 46 chains. So yarn over, pull through. That's one chain. Yarn over, pull through. Second chain, yarn over, pull through, and this is the third chain. And we do 46 chains in total. Okay, so I've got 46 chains made, and we're going to start the first row. First, we're going to make one treble in the 6th chain from the hook. So this is the first loop just before the hook, then the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, the 5th, and the 6th. So this is the 6th chain from the hook, and we're going to make one treble. This is the UK term. In the United States it's called double stitch. So we yarn over, then we pull through a loop, yarn over again, pull through the loop, and we've got 3 loops on the hook. Yarn over, pull through first 2 loops, we've got 2 left, and we yarn over and pull through the next loops. And what this creates is the beginning square. I've seen and heard it called different names in filet crochet. Some call it an empty panel, and then the one with trebles call it a full panel or filled panel. I like to call them squares because that's what they seem to me. So For me, this is the beginning square. And now what we're going to do throughout the whole first row will be make one chain, so yarn over, pull through, then skip a stitch on the chain and make a treble or a double if you are in the US or prefer American terminology, and make the treble or double into the second chain that you've got. So skip a stitch and put a treble in here. And this is what I call half square. This chain one, skip a stitch and the treble in the next stitch. I will be calling that half a square because this is actually what it kind of looks like. It's this space here and then the line there. So it's like if you cut a square diagonally, you would get half of the square. And we make those half squares until the end. So in total with this one half square, we're going to have 20 half squares like that. So this was the first one, the second one, one chain, skip a stitch, one treble into the next stitch. So this is a second half square and third chain one and treble or a double into the next stitch. It is flimsy at first and it may seem like you're making large holes in here. As long as you don't pull too hard on those loops, it will be fine in the end, so don't worry too much if you create larger holes, but try not to pull too much because then it will actually make the spaces in between the trebles too small and the holes will be too large and it may not look the greatest. So again, chain one, one treble until the end of the row. Okay, so I'm making the last half square in the row, chain one and one treble or double crochet. So after you've finished your first row, it will look something like that. Turn your work and we will do a beginning square, and it will be like that until the end of the project. And this is chain 4, and put a treble after a skipped stitch, so it will be into the treble from the previous row. Okay, so this beginning square, the four chains is the 3 chains as a treble, and the 4th one is this little break. I'm going to put a stitch marker into the 3rd chain, just because later on it will be easier for me to find where I'm supposed to put the stitch. We've got our beginning square, and now we're going to make 38 trebles. Some of the trebles will have to be put into the chain, and with such yarn, such thin yarn, I like to actually try to put my hook kind of upside down. I mean, I don't go from the up, although it might be easy for you to find the 2 loops. but I often find that it's easier for me to kind of go upside down, go under the one loop, the bottom loop, and then return the correct side up, and then do the treble. This usually works easier for me. It doesn't have to work like that for you. Whichever way you do it, it will be fine. And then the next treble gets into the treble, so it's easier. So this is how you're going to work. Remember, a treble is yarn over, pull the hook through a loop from the previous stitch, then you catch the yarn, so yarn over, pull through this loop, then yarn over, pull through 2 loops, and yarn over, pull through 2 loops. So 38 trebles like that, and you can pause the video and meet me after you've made those 38 trebles. And after you've made 38 squares, we're going to make a half square. So chain 1, skip a stitch, and put a treble into the next stitch. And this is a finished row 2. So basically that's the end of the border. Now we're going to work on the panel itself. So turn your work and we will begin row 3. Now row 3 starts with a beginning square. So chain 4 and skip a stitch, a treble into the next stitch. Then we put 2 trebles, so 1 treble into the next 2 stitches, 1 and 2, and this is actually the side border, half square and a full panel square. Now we're going to make 17 half squares. So remember, chain 1, skip a stitch, and a treble crochet into the next stitch. So that's 1 half square. Chain 1, skip a stitch, and a treble into the next stitch. That's the second half square, and meet me again after you've made 17 half squares. Okay, 17 half squares done. So time for the other side border, and that is 2 trebles, 1 in each next stitch, 2 next stitches, and then the ending square, which is kind of like a half square. It's just that it's at the end of the row, and that is chain 1 and put a treble into a stitch after a skipped stitch, or you can do it as in put a treble into the 3rd chain from the previous row's beginning square, and that's why I was putting the stitch marker. You can either do it like I did last time, straight after making the beginning half square, or after doing the row just so later on you don't have to stress so much about where to put the stitch. So that was row 3. Now turn your work and we will begin row 4, where the actual pattern of the heart will start being visible. And we begin row 4 with the beginning square, so chain 4, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, then 2 trebles so that we have the border, and now 8 half squares. So chain 1, skip a stitch, a treble into the next stitch, that's first half square, chain 1, a treble into the next stitch, that's the second half square, and meet me when you've made 8 half squares. Now we will be making 2 trebles. The first treble will go into the chain from the previous row, and then the second treble into the treble from the previous row, and we're back to 8 half squares. So chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, and again chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch. So that's 2 half squares. We need 6 more to have 8 in total. Meet me after you've finished. So we're almost at the end of the row. So the border stitches, 2 trebles, and the ending square. So skip a stitch and a treble into the third chain stitch from the previous row. And now time to stitch row 5, your work, and we begin row 5 with beginning square, so 4 chains and skip a stitch, a treble into the next stitch, then 2 trebles, so that's our side border. Now we're going to make 7 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next treble. So that was the first, this is the second, and continue until you've made 7 half squares. Now we're going to make 6 trebles. The first one will go into the chain from the previous row, that's first. Then it will be a little easier because we've got trebles in the previous row. And again, a treble into the chain, and our last treble in this sequence is again on a treble from the previous row. And because the pattern for the first part of the design is very symmetrical, now we're making 7 half squares. So chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next treble, and again chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next treble. Make 7 half squares in total and meet me in a moment. And we're back at the side, so 2 trebles, and chain 1, skip a stitch and put a treble into the third chain from the previous row. I won't be using the stitch markers anymore because one, they make noise, and also I don't always put them where they should be anyway. So we've got row 5 complete, so it's time to stitch row 6. Turn your work and the beginning square, so chain 4, and 1 treble after a skipped stitch, then 2 trebles, so we've got our side finished. Now 6 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch. That's first, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch. That's the second half square. Meet me after you've made 6. Now we're going to make 10 trebles. So the first one is in the chain from the previous row, then 6 will be quite easy because you put them in the trebles, then again in a chain and in a treble. So meet me after you've stitched 10 trebles after the last half square. Now again 6 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch. So meet me after you've stitched 6 half squares. And again the side border, so 2 trebles and then the ending square, chain 1 and a treble into the third chain from the previous row. So this is row 6. So turn your work and we'll start row 7. And row 7 starts with the beginning square, so chain 4, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, and then 2 trebles, and now 5 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and treble into the next stitch, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, and we need 3 more half squares, so meet me in a moment. Okay, and now we will be making 14 trebles. The first one will be in the chain from the previous row, then into the trebles from the previous row, and again in the chain and in the treble. So 14 trebles in total, and meet me in a moment. Now 5 more half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next treble, and this should be quicker row because there will be fewer half squares for a while. Okay, and we've got sides to finish, so 2 trebles, and then the ending half square, so chain 1 and a treble into the third chain from the previous row, And row 7 is finished, and we're actually in 1/3 of the project. So turn your work, and row 8 starts with a beginning square, so chain 4, skip a stitch and a treble into the next treble, then 2 trebles to make the side border, and then 4 half squares, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, so 4 of these, and now 18 trebles, and again the first treble is in the chain from the previous row, so it's a bit more difficult to get into. Then all the trebles that we've done in the previous row, and again a treble into the chain after the sequence of trebles, and the last will be on the next treble. So meet me after you've stitched 18 trebles in total. After you've stitched 18 trebles, we've got 4 half squares to make, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch. And again a side border, so 2 trebles, and the ending square, so chain 1, skip a stitch and put a stitch into the 3rd chain from the previous row. Okay, so this is what it should look like after the first 8 rows. You can see the bottom of the heart starting to form. Turn your work, row 9, and again beginning square, chain 4, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, then 2 trebles for the border. Now 3 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a stitch into the next stitch, so the treble from the row below, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the stitch from the row below, and chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the stitch below. So we've got 3 empty half squares, or 3 half squares, now 22 trebles, and the first one will be into the chain from the row below, then 1 treble into each treble from the previous sequence, again in the chain and in the next treble. So meet me after you've made 22 trebles. After you've made 22 trebles, we still need 3 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, and the last one, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, and the border, a treble into the next 2 trebles, so 2 trebles, and then the ending square, so chain 1 and put a treble into the 3rd chain from the row below, and row 9 is finished. Turn your work. Row 10 starts with the beginning square, chain 4, and a treble into the next stitch after the skipped stitch, and then 2 trebles, then 2 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch, and a treble into the next stitch. These are the 2 half squares. Now 26 trebles, so a long sequence. The first treble into the chain from the row below, and then trebles into the trebles, again a treble into the chain, and the last treble in the sequence will be in that treble of the first half square after the sequence of trebles. So stitch 26 trebles and meet me when you've finished. Okay, after the long sequence of 26 trebles, we need 2 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, and again chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next treble, then 2 trebles, and the ending square, so chain 1 and the treble into the third chain from the previous row. So this is row 10 finished. Turn your work, and this will be row 11, but in the same way you will be doing another few rows until row 15. So row 11, 12, 13, 14 and 15 look exactly the same. So the beginning square, 4 chains, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, then 2 trebles, then 1 half square, and the longest sequence of trebles, 30, starting here in this chain from the previous row, stitching over those trebles, then again chain here and into the treble here. So 30 trebles. Meet me after you've finished making all those trebles. And now half square, just 1 in this row, so chain 1, skip a stitch and the treble into the next stitch, 2 trebles in the border, and the ending square, so chain 1 and a treble into the third chain from the previous row. So we've got 11 rows done. Like I said, the next 4 rows look exactly the same, so you can pause the video, make rows until you finish row 15, and meet me back to begin row 16. Okay, 15 rows finished, so let's begin row 16. So turn your work, and row 16 will be the moment to start showing the heart shape a bit more clearly. And we start row 16 with the beginning square. So chain 4 and skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, and then 2 trebles, one half square, and 14 trebles. Now we put all trebles into the trebles from rows before, so this one will be easier, but we still need to make 14 of them. So you can pause the video and meet me when you've done 14 trebles. Okay, 14 trebles made. Now a half square, so chain 1, skip 1 treble from the row below and put a treble into the next treble, and then again 14 trebles, and this time we will reach the last treble from the sequence of the row before. So you can count just to make sure that you are in a correct spot, but also you can just make trebles into the trebles below, and once you reach a chain, it means you need to stop making trebles. But click pause and meet me after you finished 14 trebles. Okay, 14 trebles made, and now 1 half square, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, then the side border, 2 trebles, and the ending square, so chain 1 and put a stitch into the 3rd chain from the row below, or just skip a stitch if you prefer it this way. So this is row 16, and you can already see a little bit of this heart shape happening, but it will be more clear in row 17. So turn your work. We are starting with the beginning square, so chain 4, skip a stitch and put a treble into the next stitch, then 2 trebles, so we've got the side border. Now 2 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and put a treble into the next stitch. Now 10 trebles, and again we're making trebles into the trebles from the row below, so it should be easier. Click pause and meet me after you finished 10 trebles. Now 3 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, and chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, and again 10 trebles into trebles from the row below. So pause the video and meet me after you've finished. Now 2 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, and chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch. Now 2 trebles, and the ending square, so chain 1, skip a stitch and put the treble into the next stitch, or put the treble into the 3rd chain from the row below. So as you can see, the heart is already visible. There's this widening, then a bit of straight, and now we are circling the top here. So row 18, we will begin with a beginning square, so chain 4, skip a stitch and put a treble into the next stitch, then 2 trebles, now 3 half squares, so chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch, and chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch. So 3 half squares done. Now 6 trebles, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And now 5 half squares. So chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch. And meet me after you've made 5 half squares. And again 6 trebles into the trebles from the row before. So they are quite easy to make and quite fast to make. That's 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now 3 half squares, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble in the row below, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble in the row below, chain 1, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch. Now 2 trebles and chain 1, the ending square, chain 1 and a treble into the 3rd chain from the previous row. So now our heart is finished, not the panel, just the pattern. So now we will be repeating row 3, so this one with a lot of empty panels, then row 2 and then row 1. So we will mirror those. So turn your work, beginning square, skip a stitch and a treble into the next stitch. Now 2 trebles, and now 17 half squares. So we will get to this point here. Just to remind you, half square is chain 1, skip a stitch and make a treble crochet into the next stitch. Meet me back after you've made 17 half squares. Okay, 17 half squares made, so 2 trebles to make the side border and the ending square, so chain 1 and put a treble into the 3rd chain from the row below. Turn your work, so we begin with the beginning square, chain 4, skip a stitch and put a treble into the next stitch, and now make 38 trebles. So you will be putting the trebles both into the trebles and also in the chains, and the 38 trebles will get you to here at the end of the side border. So meet me back after you've made those 38 trebles to do the ending square and then make the final row of the pattern. 38 trebles later, we end the row with the ending square, so chain 1 and put a treble into the 3rd treble of the chain from the row below. So turn your work, and now we'll be making row 21, which is the last row of the pattern. So chain 4 and skip a stitch, put a treble into the next stitch, so the beginning square as usual. And now make 19 half squares, get to here, and then make the ending half squares. And a half square is chain 1, skip a stitch, and put a treble into the next stitch. So meet me in 19 half squares. And the last stitch of the pattern, the ending square, chain 1, and put a treble into the third chain from the previous row's beginner square. So this is the full panel. Now fasten off, so chain 1, cut your yarn, and pull the thread through and just weave in the ends. So this is the heart pattern. Next time I will show you the diamond tile, so if you would like to make a series, this will be the card suits series. So this is what the finished panel looked like after weaving in the ends, and with 1.25 hook it measures 14.5 centimeters by 14.5 centimeters. It's actually more or less square. The other ones that I did are similar. I mean, this purple one is very similar in size, but it was also made with a 1.25 hook. But this one is smaller. This one was made with a 1mm hook, and it measures 12.5 centimeters by 12, or closer to 13 centimeters. I haven't blocked any of the panels. I did, however, spray starch these two, and they're a little bit more stiff than this one that I have really just stretched a little bit to make it a bit more square. You can block it, of course, but I think if you want to use them as coasters or doilies, starching them would be a good idea, because they are really nice and stiff, those that are starched. This one is a little bit softer, so it all depends on what you like, how you want it to feel, so the choice is yours. And this is what my 3 panels look like together. I could make a 4th one just to make a set, and maybe I will in the future, but next time I'll be showing you how to make a diamond shape panel, so that you could have a set of card suits. So next time it will be diamond, but this is what the hearts look like.